Why is it that so many religious people believe that atheists can be converted, as if it's just a matter of saying the right words, quoting the right verse, or delivering the right emotional speech? They often treat it like a marketing pitch. If you hear the message often enough, sooner or later, you'll come around. But that assumption misunderstands something fundamental about how belief actually works. Atheists, by definition, don't lack exposure to religion. Most atheists were raised in religious households, surrounded by rituals, traditions, and sermons. They didn't just miss the message, they heard it many times. They saw it lived out by parents, relatives, neighbors, and teachers, and in many cases they followed it seriously before eventually walking away. So when someone shows up with a Bible verse or a story about personal salvation, it's not new information. It's a repeat of something already known, already examined, already tested, and ultimately found unconvincing. Religion often thrives in environments where questioning is discouraged, but atheism usually emerges after long periods of questioning. It's not a knee-jerk rejection. It's the result of comparing claims to evidence, weighing morality against doctrine, and noticing contradictions that can't be explained away. When someone has already walked that road, it's not possible to pull them back with a simple emotional plea. They've seen behind the curtain. Think about how marketing works. If someone has never heard of a product, an ad might spark curiosity. But if someone has already used the product, studied its ingredients, researched its flaws, and decided it doesn't do what it promises, then no commercial can undo that experience. Religion is similar. Once you've inspected the claims and found them lacking, repetition doesn't change the conclusion. This is why conversations between believers and atheists so often feel frustrating to both sides. Believers think atheists are being stubborn or closed-minded, but in reality, it's the opposite. It's usually the willingness to question and to reconsider deeply held assumptions that led them out of faith in the first place. And when the same arguments keep being recycled, arguments they've heard 100 times before, it doesn't come across as persuasive, it comes across as unoriginal. One of the most common attempts at conversion is through fear. The threat of eternal punishment, the image of hell, the idea that disbelief will lead to endless suffering. But fear only works when it's tied to belief in the first place. If you're no longer convinced that the threat is real, it loses its power. It's like being told that if you don't obey, an invisible dragon will burn you alive. If you don't believe in dragons, the threat means nothing. It sounds harsh, but that's how it feels to someone who has already left religion. The same is true for promises of heaven. To someone who doesn't believe the premise, the reward has no weight. It's like being told you'll miss out on a vacation to a city that doesn't exist. There's no sense of loss because the city was never real to begin with. And yet, many believers are convinced that atheists just haven't heard the good news properly. They think that if the story is told in a more passionate way or with more personal conviction, it will suddenly click. But again, the issue isn't ignorance, it's disbelief. Hearing the same claims from a different voice doesn't change the fact that the claims themselves don't hold up under scrutiny. There's also an assumption that atheists are secretly broken or searching, as if disbelief is a wound that needs healing. But in reality, many atheists feel freer, more grounded, and more at peace after leaving religion than they ever did while practicing it. For them, attempts at conversion don't come across as helpful. They come across as intrusive, like someone trying to sell a cure for an illness you don't have. What often goes unrecognized is that attempts to convert atheists reveal something deeper about the believer's own mindset. Religion, for many, isn't just a private belief. It's a framework that demands expansion. It insists on being spread, reinforced, and confirmed by others. That's why missionaries exist, why evangelism is a duty, why entire movements are built around convincing outsiders. But atheism doesn't operate that way. It doesn't depend on numbers to validate itself. This difference in psychology explains why believers often misinterpret atheists' resistance. They expect that persistence will eventually pay off, because within religion, that's often how belief spreads. But outside of that echo chamber, once you've examined the claims with a critical lens, there's no way back to unquestioning acceptance. It's like trying to unlearn how to read. Another common attempt to convert atheists is through appeals to morality. Believers often argue that without religion, there's no foundation for right and wrong. They say that without God, morality is subjective, shifting, and ultimately meaningless. But for someone who has already stepped outside of that framework, this argument doesn't hold up. The reality is that atheists are not living without morality. They still care about fairness, compassion, justice, and the well-being of others. In fact, studies consistently show that non-religious people are just as capable of empathy and altruism as religious people. Sometimes even more so, because their moral decisions are based on reasoning and mutual respect, rather than fear of punishment or desire for reward. When you tell an atheist that they can't be moral without God, it doesn't sound persuasive. It sounds insulting. It overlooks the fact that societies have been building ethical systems long before and outside of the major religions. Ancient philosophies in Greece, China, and India discussed justice, responsibility, and virtue without needing divine authority to back them up. And today, secular laws and human rights frameworks guide billions of people in ways that religion often never managed to achieve. There's also a psychological element here. People are far less likely to change their worldview when they feel attacked. If a believer says, "You can't be moral without my religion," it comes across as dismissive, not convincing. The conversation ends before it begins. And this is why so many attempts at converting atheists actually backfire. They reinforce the atheist's conviction that religion misrepresents reality. Another angle often used is the appeal to meaning. Believers claim that without God, life has no purpose. It's framed as though atheism automatically leads to despair. But that's not how it works in practice. Many atheists feel that life becomes more meaningful once you remove the idea of a divine overseer, because instead of following a script written by someone else, you are writing your own story. Purpose doesn't vanish without religion. It transforms. It becomes personal, flexible, and real. The joy of raising a child, the satisfaction of creating art, the thrill of exploring knowledge. These are meaningful in themselves, not because a higher power declares them so. And when someone tries to argue otherwise, it doesn't strike atheists as persuasive. It strikes them as a misunderstanding of what purpose actually feels like. There's also the fact that people rarely shift their core worldview because of a single argument. Research in psychology shows that belief systems are deeply tied to identity. They aren't just about facts or logic, they're about community, family, history, and emotion. When atheists let go of religion, it's not because they heard one clever counterargument. It's usually a long process of questioning, reflecting, and noticing that the pieces don't fit together anymore. So when a believer steps in with what they think is a gotcha argument, it doesn't undo that journey. If anything, it highlights how little they understand about why people leave religion in the first place. A fascinating example comes from missionary efforts. Billions of dollars are spent every year trying to spread religion to new regions and cultures. And yet, studies show that in places with higher education, better access to information, and exposure to diverse viewpoints, conversion rates drop dramatically. Why? Because once people learn how to think critically, they're far less likely to accept claims without evidence. It's not about ignorance, it's about awareness. In fact, one of the reasons atheism is growing globally is because people are more connected than ever before. They can hear arguments, read criticisms, and explore perspectives that were once hidden. In a closed community, conversion might work. In an open world, it doesn't. Because when people have access to knowledge, they don't go backward to dogma. They go forward to independence. And here's something many believers miss. Most atheists are not on a mission to deconvert others. They're not knocking on doors or handing out pamphlets. They're just living their lives. And this is perhaps the clearest sign that they can't be converted back. Because their worldview isn't propped up by convincing others. It stands on its own. This is where the tension comes in. Religious systems often feel fragile if they're not constantly reinforced. That's why you hear the emphasis on fellowship, group worship, and spreading the message. But atheism doesn't require that constant reinforcement. It's stable precisely because it's based on the absence of belief, not the maintenance of it. That's why conversion attempts bounce off. There's nothing for them to stick to. One of the clearest ways to see why atheists can't be converted is by looking at real-world cases where people have tried. Evangelical churches often organize outreach events specifically targeted at non-believers. They bring in professional apologists, they use polished speeches, and they try to anticipate every objection. And yet, surveys consistently show that these efforts rarely move the needle. In fact, in some cases, they push people further away. Take university campuses as an example. In the United States, there are student groups funded with millions of dollars every year, specifically dedicated to persuading young people that Christianity is the only truth. They hold debates, they hand out books, they invite speakers with degrees and titles to give the impression of authority. But when researchers follow up with students afterward, the pattern is striking. Very few, if any, actually change their worldview. Many simply become more confident in their non-belief because they realize the arguments don't hold up under scrutiny. This isn't because atheists are stubborn, it's because once someone learns how to test ideas against evidence, they don't easily accept claims that can't meet that standard. When an apologist says, "You must believe or face eternal consequences," it might sound persuasive within a religious framework, but outside of that framework, it just sounds like emotional blackmail. It's no more convincing than a threat in a playground. Psychology explains this well. There's a phenomenon called reactance. It means that when people feel their freedom of thought is being threatened, they resist even harder. If you tell someone, "You must believe this or you're doomed," you're not just giving them information, you're challenging their autonomy. And most people, especially those who've already broken away from religion, will respond by reinforcing their independence, not surrendering it. Another real-world example comes from street preaching. You'll sometimes see videos of preachers confronting atheists in public. They shout about sin, they warn about hell, they insist that salvation is the only answer. And the response from non-believers is usually laughter, irritation, or complete indifference. Rarely does anyone say, "You know what? I've never thought of it that way, I'll convert right now," because the method doesn't work. It's not designed to genuinely engage with questions. It's designed to create fear. And fear is not a stable foundation for truth. Even in private conversations, the story is the same. Many atheists have family members or friends who continually try to win them back to faith. They send articles, invite them to services, or argue during holidays. But rather than persuading, these attempts usually strain relationships. Because the atheist is not rejecting religion out of ignorance, they've already examined it. So each new attempt feels less like a sincere dialogue and more like pressure, and pressure drives people away. The irony is that conversion attempts reveal a deeper problem inside religion itself. If faith were truly self-evident, if its truth were undeniable, why would it require such constant selling and persuading? The need to keep convincing others is a symptom of fragility, not strength. Atheism doesn't have that problem. You don't need to hold rallies to keep people from disbelieving in Zeus. Once you stop believing, the default is stability. Sociology adds another layer here. Studies show that when people leave religion, they usually do so after a long internal struggle. It's not a casual decision. They've weighed the social costs, the fear of punishment, the risk of alienation. And if they've still chosen to leave, that means their conviction is strong. So when someone tries to convert them back with a few Bible verses or a promise of eternal life, it feels shallow in comparison to the depth of their journey. It's also worth noting that persuasion works differently depending on what's at stake. If you're trying to convince someone to try a new food, the cost is low. They might say, "Sure, I'll give it a shot." But when it comes to a worldview, especially one that involves your entire understanding of reality, the stakes are infinitely higher. People don't gamble with that based on a single conversation. They need overwhelming reasons, and religion doesn't provide those. Even when religious groups adapt their strategies, using modern music, one of the biggest reasons atheists resist conversion lies in how the human mind protects coherence. Once someone has built a worldview that makes sense, they're reluctant to accept ideas that would tear it apart. Psychologists call this cognitive consistency. It means our minds try to avoid contradictions. If an atheist has concluded that natural explanations account for the universe, introducing supernatural claims creates conflict, and instead of adopting the conflict, the brain filters it out. That doesn't mean atheists are closed-minded. It means their worldview is already organized around a framework that works. They can explain morality through human empathy and social evolution. They can explain the universe through physics and cosmology. They can explain meaning through relationships, creativity, and knowledge. None of these require invisible beings or supernatural threats. So when religion offers those explanations, they don't add anything. They actually complicate things unnecessarily. This is connected to another psychological principle called critical thinking habits. Once someone has trained themselves to ask, what's the evidence? What's the source? Does this explanation fit reality? They apply those questions everywhere, and faith-based claims are uniquely vulnerable to this process. Because by definition, they don't rest on testable evidence. They rest on tradition, authority, and emotion. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Every attempt to convert an atheist has to confront that filter, and the filter is strong. There's also something called sunk cost reasoning, but in reverse. In religion, people often stay because they've already invested years of belief, rituals, and community. The thought of being wrong feels too costly, so they double down. With atheists, the sunk cost has already been dealt with. They've already walked away. They've already endured the doubts, the losses, maybe even the social backlash. That means their position is not only reasoned, but hardened by experience. They've paid the price to think freely, and once you've paid it, you're not likely to go back and undo it. Worldview shifts also have a psychological permanence. When someone moves from faith to doubt, it's usually not a sudden jump. It's gradual. It starts with a question they can't resolve. Then another. Over time, the questions pile up, and the old framework starts to collapse. By the time someone identifies as an atheist, the collapse is complete. They've rebuilt their foundation from the ground up, and that makes their position durable. Not immune to change, but resistant to flimsy persuasion. This is why conversion stories usually go in one direction. You hear of people leaving religion for good, but it's rare to hear of atheists suddenly becoming lifelong believers again. When it does happen, it's usually tied to emotional crises, not intellectual arguments. A person loses a loved one, suffers trauma, or desperately wants comfort. And in that vulnerable state, they may reach back toward faith. But even then, many admit later that their return didn't last. Because emotion fades, and when it does, the unanswered questions come back. Another factor is identity. Once someone embraces atheism, even quietly, it often becomes part of how they see themselves. They value reason, skepticism, or simply the courage to stand apart from the majority. That identity becomes a source of pride and resilience. So when someone tries to convert them, it's not just about ideas. It feels like an attack on who they are. And people rarely abandon core parts of their identity because of an argument from a stranger, or even from a family member. Social science research backs this up. In societies where religion is dominant, people who leave it often form communities, whether online or in person, to support each other. These networks create stability. They remind individuals that they're not alone, that non-belief is valid, that questioning is normal. And once someone finds belonging outside of religion, the incentive to return disappears. Conversion efforts run into a brick wall because the emotional benefits of faith, community, identity, meaning, have already been replaced by secular alternatives. Even the language of conversion reveals the problem. It's framed as winning a soul, gaining a number, proving a point. Rarely is it framed as a genuine two-way exchange of ideas. And atheists pick up on that. They see that the conversation is not about truth, but about recruitment. And when people feel they're being recruited, they shut down. So the psychological mechanisms at play, cognitive consistency. On a cultural level, the world is shifting in ways that make conversion efforts less and less effective. The internet alone has changed everything. Before, a religious community could control the flow of information. Leaders could shape what people heard, what books were allowed, what questions were acceptable. But now, anyone with doubts can type a few words into a search bar and immediately find thousands of perspectives. Not just one opinion, but debates, scientific evidence, historical critiques, and personal stories from people who walked away from faith. Once that door is open, it can't be closed. This is why you often see religious groups try to warn their members away from certain websites, authors, or even friends. Because exposure to unfiltered information is one of the fastest ways to dissolve belief. And it works in one direction. A person can start religious and then encounter critical information that pulls them away. But once they're outside, there isn't an equivalent force that pulls them back in. Because the outside world isn't hiding anything. The data, the evidence, the counter-arguments are all open. the transparency itself strengthens the non-believing position. Secular societies also reveal something powerful. Countries with higher levels of education, freedom, and social safety nets tend to have higher rates of non-belief. That correlation alone speaks volumes. When people feel secure in their lives, when they trust science, when they know their basic needs are met, the appeal of religion fades. And in those environments, conversion campaigns don't gain much ground. In fact, they often stand out as outdated, even desperate. Another cultural shift is generational. Younger people across the globe are more skeptical of authority than older generations. They grew up with technology, with instant access to contradictory perspectives. They've seen hypocrisy play out in politics and religion alike, often on video clips shared around the world. That creates an immunity to appeals from authority. If a preacher says, "Believe this because I say so," or because the Bible says so, younger people are more likely to respond with, "Why should that mean anything to me?" And once a generation builds that reflex, conversion strategies that worked in the past collapse. Religious institutions sense this. That's why so many of their campaigns are targeted at young people. But ironically, the harder they push, the more transparent it looks. Teens and young adults see the marketing, the stage lights, the emotional manipulation, and recognize it as a performance. They're used to advertising, to influencers, to carefully crafted persuasion. And once you recognize something as persuasion, it loses power. That's why attempts to repackage religion in modern forms, with rock bands, Instagram accounts, or polished media, often backfire. They highlight how artificial the whole thing is. Conversion also runs into a global identity problem. In an interconnected world, people are constantly exposed to dozens of competing religions. You can watch a Buddhist monk on YouTube, a Hindu festival on TikTok, a Muslim prayer call live-streamed, and a Christian sermon in the same afternoon. That exposure makes the exclusivity claim of any one religion feel absurd. Why would one culture's story be true while all others are false? And once that perspective clicks, it's not something that conversion can undo. There's also backlash to aggressive proselytizing. In many secular regions, people see door-to-door evangelism or street preaching as intrusive, even rude. And instead of sparking curiosity, it sparks irritation. People don't convert from annoyance. They pull further away. It's the same with public debates. When religious figures try to argue atheists into faith, their arguments are dissected online within hours. Every logical fallacy, every emotional trick gets broken down in comment sections and forums. The more these arguments are exposed, the weaker they look. Global trends confirm this. Surveys show rising numbers of people identifying as knowns, no religious affiliation. And while some are spiritual in a vague sense, the majority lean towards secular reasoning. This isn't happening in just one region. It's happening in Europe, in the Americas, in parts of Asia, even in historically religious nations. Conversion attempts have to swim against that tide, and the tide is strong. The irony is that the harder religious groups push, the more they highlight their own insecurity. The sheer need to convince others suggests doubt within. And people sense that. When someone is truly confident in their worldview, they don't chase down strangers to validate it. The fact that religions often depend on recruitment exposes how fragile the foundation is. By contrast, atheists don't usually run conversion campaigns, and yet their numbers keep growing. That contrast alone tells a story about where the momentum lies. So when you zoom out and look at the global picture, it becomes clear why converting atheists is almost impossible. The cultural shifts, the internet, the generational skepticism, the exposure to multiple religions, and the rise of secular societies all reinforce non-belief. Conversion is not just difficult, it's structurally out of step with the modern world. At the deepest level, the reason atheists can't be converted isn't just intellectual. It's not just about arguments, history, or science. It's about how meaning itself is constructed. When someone steps away from religion, they often go through a period of rethinking everything: morality, purpose, community, even mortality. And once they rebuild those foundations without gods, the old religious framework has nowhere to attach. Take morality. Religious arguments often hinge on the idea that without God, morality collapses. But once you've lived outside that framework and discovered that moral reasoning still works, and often works better, the argument loses all weight. If you've seen firsthand that compassion, fairness, and cooperation don't require divine commands, you don't go back to thinking they do. That switch doesn't flip in reverse. The same is true for meaning. Religion claims to offer ultimate purpose. But many atheists discover purpose through relationships, creativity, knowledge, or simply living authentically. Once you've experienced that those sources of meaning are real and fulfilling, the claim that you need a cosmic plan feels hollow. If anything, it feels limiting. Why shrink your life down to fit someone else's story when you've already seen that meaning can be self-created? Then there's the question of death. Religion often relies on fear of mortality to hold believers. Promises of heaven or threats of hell are supposed to keep people in line. But once you've confronted the reality of death without those promises and learned to make peace with it, that fear doesn't hold the same power. In fact, it can feel liberating. Life becomes more precious when you know it's finite. Every moment matters more, not less. And once you've internalized that perspective, the sales pitch of eternal life doesn't sound appealing. It sounds unnecessary, even absurd. Even community, which is often cited as religion's strength, can be rebuilt. Many atheists form connections in secular groups, in online forums, in social movements, in friendships, and families. Once you realize that belonging doesn't depend on shared worship, the threat of "you'll be alone without church" rings empty. People see that real community comes from honesty, trust, and shared values, not from reciting the same prayers. This is why conversion efforts bounce off. They're trying to offer something that's already been replaced with something better. It's like trying to sell someone an old flip phone after they've gotten used to a smartphone. You can talk about how the flip phone was reliable, how it used to be good enough, but once someone's experienced the new system, they're not going back. The difference is too stark. At its core, the inability to convert atheists comes down to one thing. Once you've built a worldview grounded in evidence, in reason, and in lived experience, you don't replace it with one built on authority, tradition, and fear. The foundation is stronger, the structure is more flexible, and most importantly, it's honest. That honesty becomes non-negotiable. Religions depend on belief being fragile, passed down, protected from doubt, reinforced by community pressure. But atheism, once fully embraced, isn't fragile. It doesn't need reinforcement from others. It doesn't collapse when questioned. That durability makes conversion nearly impossible, because the person on the outside doesn't just lack belief, they've already outgrown it. And that's the quiet truth. The people trying to convert atheists don't realize they're not arguing with empty vessels waiting to be filled. They're arguing with people who have already filled their lives with meaning, morality, and understanding on their own terms. There's nothing missing, nothing to fix, and no sales pitch that can undo that. That's why, at the end of the day, you can't convert atheists, not because they're stubborn, not because they're closed-minded, but because once you've stepped outside and seen the bigger picture, there's no reason to go back inside.